I still remember the first time my wife, Alina, mentioned going out with her girlfriends. We'd been married for about 3 years by then, and I'd always trusted her implicitly. She never gave me any reason to doubt her motives, and I never wanted to be the type of husband who questioned every outing or every phone call. When she said she'd be going out for a girls' night, some wine, good conversation, maybe a restaurant or club, I took it at face value. She deserved to blow off steam, just as I did when I went out with my friends. Marriage, after all, required trust and space for each other to breathe. And so, for years, I didn't think twice when she mentioned these little get-togethers. They were simply part of her life, as normal to me as grocery shopping or weekend hikes. A few months ago, though, little discrepancies started cropping up. Alina's tone would shift ever so slightly whenever she mentioned her next girls' night. The details of who would be there or what time she would head out became oddly vague. She wouldn't volunteer the usual names I'd heard before, like Kayla or Dana, close friends who had attended our wedding and felt almost like family. Instead, she'd say, just a few of the girls, or, they're some coworkers, you wouldn't know them. Something in her voice sounded forced. Initially, I brushed it off because it felt paranoid to suspect her over minor changes in word choice. But a pit formed in my stomach that I couldn't quite ignore, and a new seed of doubt quietly took root. I tried to keep that doubt at bay, reminding myself that marriage always has ebbs and flows. Maybe Alina was stressed at work and didn't have time to rehash every single detail. Maybe her old circle of friends had gone in different directions, and she was making new connections through her job. It wasn't impossible. Yet, I noticed another odd thing: Alina started to dress more provocatively for these outings. She'd stand in front of the mirror, carefully applying bold lipstick, styling her hair with more flair, sometimes wearing a dress that hugged her figure in a way she rarely did for simple get-togethers. When I teased her lightly, "Wow, you're going all out tonight, is it a special occasion?" she'd just shrug and smile, as if I was reading too much into her choice of clothes. I tried to accept her explanation, but a part of me couldn't help feeling unsettled. She seemed to be putting in the kind of effort I was used to seeing on our date nights, not on casual gatherings with girlfriends. It really began to escalate a month later. I came home early from work unexpectedly because a client meeting got cancelled. Usually, Alina would let me know if she left the house, but I walked into a strangely empty, silent home. My first guess was that she'd gone grocery shopping or to pick up coffee. But I noticed her car was still in the driveway. My curiosity piqued, and I looked around. The living room was neat, the kitchen sink empty, no sign of her in the backyard. Eventually, I found her in the guest bedroom, standing near the closet with her phone pressed to her ear. She jumped when she saw me, fumbling her phone so badly she almost dropped it. I asked if everything was okay. She stammered something about needing a quiet place to speak with a coworker, then quickly changed the subject. I tried to shrug it off, but she looked rattled, like a child caught doing something wrong. That tense moment stuck with me long after the conversation ended. Over the ensuing weeks, my awareness sharpened. I noticed she'd step outside to take calls more frequently, or she'd leave the room if her phone vibrated. She developed new passwords for her devices without telling me. I didn't want to pry, but I felt her energy shifting. The closeness we once shared was replaced by this layer of distance. Our dinner conversations became perfunctory. At night, she'd often crawl into bed exhausted, or claim she had to finish work on her laptop, staying up far later than usual. Some mornings, I'd find her dozing on the couch, laptop open but with the screen turned black. Each small change was like a drop of water in a bucket of suspicion that was steadily filling up. One day, out of the blue, Alina announced she'd be going out that night for another girls' night. She barely offered any explanation, just a terse mention that the girls wanted to decompress after a hectic project at work. Something in my gut told me this time was different. I asked who exactly she was going with, and she gave me a couple of generic names, ones I'd never heard before. When I pressed for details, where they were heading, how late she might be, she became uncharacteristically defensive. "Why are you grilling me?" she shot back, her eyes flashing with anger. "It's just a night out, can't I have fun without the third degree?" I was startled by her reaction. We never argued like that. It was enough to solidify my resolve to figure out what was really happening. That night, she left around 8, wearing a form-fitting black dress that left my heart pounding, partly because she looked stunning, and partly because I had a feeling she wasn't dressing up for her girlfriends. Before she went out the door, I tried to give her a goodnight kiss, but she offered only her cheek, as if her thoughts were 1,000 miles away. I stood by the window, watching her drive off, hesitating as I thought about my plan. I'd decided earlier that if she lied one more time about a girl's night, I'd follow her. I already had my car keys in hand, a jacket thrown over the kitchen chair. A swirl of doubt and guilt fluttered in my stomach. Was I crossing a line by spying on my own wife? But I needed closure, or at least some reassurance that my suspicions were baseless. So, about 5 minutes after she disappeared down the street, I stepped outside, locked up the house, and got into my car. I tried to stay a few cars back, not wanting to be too obvious. It was already dark, which helped me remain inconspicuous. My heart pounded as I navigated the familiar streets, headlights illuminating her sedan a short distance ahead. After about 15 minutes, I watched her signal a right turn onto a road that usually led toward the downtown area. That part of the city was lined with bars, restaurants, and nightclubs, so it wouldn't be surprising if that was her destination. Still, she kept driving past the nightlife district, merging onto a quieter stretch of road. This route didn't lead to a typical girls' night out spot. It led to an upscale neighborhood dotted with high-end boutiques and wine bars that were mostly closed at this hour. My confusion only grew. Eventually, she turned into the parking lot of a trendy lounge I'd only heard about in passing. The lot was partly empty, which made me more anxious about being seen if I parked too close. I pulled over across the street, behind a dumpster so my car wouldn't be too visible. From there, I had a decent vantage point. Alina parked, got out, and checked her phone. She glanced around, as though scanning for someone. Then she walked inside. No sign of any group of girlfriends waiting for her at the entrance. My pulse raced. I tried to keep a rational mind, maybe she was meeting them at a table inside. But deep down, the seeds of doubt felt like a full-blown weed, strangling my ability to think positively. I decided to wait, figuring I'd see a group of women arrive soon if her story was legitimate. For 10 excruciating minutes, no one else arrived. Then, at last, a single car pulled in, its headlights slicing through the dark. A man stepped out. Tall, well-dressed, he took a moment to adjust his collar in the reflection of the car window before heading toward the lounge's doors. My gut twisted with dread. Was this just a random stranger? Possibly. But something about the way he walked with confidence, like he knew precisely who was inside waiting for him, set my nerves on edge. I waited another minute or two, considering my options. I could rush inside and confront Alina on the spot. But a wild confrontation in a lounge, with no real proof yet, would be messy. Instead, I took a deep breath and decided to get closer, carefully. I snuck across the street, using parked cars as cover, until I reached the lounge's large windows. Music played inside, lights low and moody, the ambience modern and stylish. I peeked through the glass, doing my best to remain out of sight. There, near the bar, I spotted Alina seated on a tall stool, crossing her legs. She leaned forward and gave that same man a quick embrace. He slipped an arm around her waist, guiding her gently toward a table in the corner. My heart hammered so violently I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. My worst fears had just solidified before my eyes. This wasn't a gathering of coworkers or a fun night with girlfriends. She was meeting a man, alone, in an intimate setting. I felt a cold sweat break across my forehead. My hands clenched into fists as the weight of betrayal hit me. Still, I didn't burst inside. I couldn't. Part of me was so shocked I could barely move. Another part of me insisted on waiting for some indisputable sign of infidelity before I made a scene. So I crept around to a side entrance, hoping to slip in without drawing attention. The lounge had a small hallway that led to the restrooms, next to a partially enclosed area for private gatherings. That would be my best vantage point without being immediately spotted. Carefully, I inched inside. The aroma of expensive liquor and perfume swirled around me, intensifying the surreal atmosphere. I saw them clearly now, Alina, leaning toward this stranger, their heads close together, her hand occasionally brushing his arm. They laughed softly, as though sharing an inside joke. My stomach churned. It felt like someone was twisting a knife in my gut. They ordered drinks. I watched as Alina sipped from a martini glass I'd never even seen her drink at home. She'd always said she wasn't a martini fan. She looked entirely comfortable, her eyes sparkling in a way I hadn't seen in months. I felt an inexplicable urge to confront them right then, but I held back, wanting to learn more. Was she just flirting, or was there a deeper affair? The question felt naive even as I thought it. Their body language told me this wasn't a first date or a casual acquaintance. I recognized a certain familiarity in the way they touched each other's shoulders, the way she tilted her head to one side, the way he nodded along so attentively. Eventually, she leaned in, whispering something in his ear. He smirked, placed a hand on her thigh under the small table, and gave a slight squeeze. That was it for me, the final drop in an overflowing bucket. I stepped forward, but the swirl of emotions in my head erupted: rage, heartbreak, confusion, the desperate desire for an explanation. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to remain calm. I decided to capture a photo on my phone, as painful as it felt, because I knew how easily she could deny the entire situation if I confronted her without proof. With my camera aimed discreetly, I snapped a few pictures of them leaning into each other, her eyes locked on his, their closeness undeniable. Anger pulsed through my veins, but I still didn't rush over. I thought, for an agonizing second, about what confronting them in public could achieve. It might lead to a chaotic scene, maybe get me thrown out by security, and it wouldn't give me a chance to really talk to Alina. So I slipped out the side door, feeling numb, my body on autopilot. I returned to my car, breathing heavily in the darkness. My mind raced with questions. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? Why would she do this? What did I do wrong in our marriage that pushed her to this betrayal? I decided to wait in my car rather than drive off. I wanted to see how the night ended. If they left together, I had to know where they'd go. The possibility that she might take him to a hotel or even bring him back to our house made my heart hammer in disgust. Every minute that passed felt like an hour, each second chipped away at my trust, my faith in her. Eventually, maybe an hour later, they emerged from the lounge, arms loosely around each other. They were laughing, talking intimately, the light from the parking lot lamps illuminating their faces. I crouched low in the driver's seat, peeking over the steering wheel as they climbed into his car. Not hers. My pulse quickened. I started my engine and, with headlights off to avoid drawing attention, followed them out of the parking lot. He drove maybe 10 minutes, eventually pulling into a small boutique hotel. It wasn't some chain motel on the outskirts of town, it was more upscale, a place known for romantic getaways. My stomach dropped. I watched Alina get out of the car, leaning on the man's shoulder, looking up at him with an expression I remembered so clearly from our earlier days, an expression of adoration. Yet, it wasn't directed at me. The realization burned in my chest. They walked hand in hand through the entrance, not even bothering to check if anyone was watching. I had to stifle a bitter laugh at the idea of girls' night out. She wasn't even trying to hide it now, at least not from the world outside. Only from me, her husband, who was apparently too naive to realize his wife was living a double life. I sat there, paralyzed, for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced through scenarios of how this confrontation might end, me storming into the hotel lobby, demanding she come home, maybe even getting into a physical fight with her new lover. But I also saw images of police being called, humiliating headlines, family gossip swirling. And deep down, I understood that no matter how I confronted her, the damage was already done. We couldn't go back to the life we once had. Something fundamental had broken between us. Still, I needed to know how far this had gone. Did she plan to stay overnight? Was this an ongoing affair or a spontaneous fling? The torment felt unbearable. Eventually, after nearly half an hour of agonized deliberation, I forced myself to start the car and drive home. I didn't trust myself to handle the confrontation with composure if I marched into that hotel room. I also realized that in my current state, shaking with adrenaline and heartbreak, nothing I did or said would be calm or rational. On the drive, tears stung my eyes. There were moments I had to blink furiously just to see the road. I felt a whirlwind of betrayal, fury, sorrow, even self-blame. Questions like, what did I do wrong, or was I not enough for her, looped in my mind, pulling me into a darker place with each repetition. At home, the silence was suffocating. Everything in the living room, the kitchen, the bedroom was laced with memories of us, pictures on the walls, the wedding photo on the mantel, notes she'd left me over the years in random places. Part of me wanted to tear them all down, rip them to pieces in some act of catharsis. But I resisted, telling myself to wait until I had calmed down. I paced the floors, eventually settling in front of the fireplace, phone in hand. I opened the gallery to look at the photos I'd taken at the lounge. My heart sank further each time I swiped through them. There was no plausible explanation besides an affair. Her posture, the intimate closeness, the affectionate touching, it was all the damning evidence I needed. And yet, I felt hollow, like I was looking at someone else's life. Alina didn't come home that night. Around midnight, I texted her, "Where are you?" which I regretted the moment I sent it. It was a weak, desperate message. She didn't respond. At 2 a.m, after more endless pacing, I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. I curled up on the couch, not wanting to sleep in our bed alone, the bed that now felt tainted by her absence and her betrayal. I barely slept, my mind racing with anger and sorrow in equal measure. When the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains, I felt a strange sense of numbness wash over me, like I'd cried all the tears I had and there was nothing left. She walked in at around 6 a.m, her face drawn, hair slightly messy. She didn't look triumphant or carefree. Instead, she seemed weighed down by some internal conflict, but that didn't deter me from the immediate rage that welled in my chest. I stood up from the couch as she closed the door behind her. We locked eyes, and for a moment, neither of us knew what to say. The tension was suffocating. Finally, she broke the silence with a shaky whisper, "I'm sorry." Her voice caught in her throat, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't mean." "Don't," I cut her off, my voice shaking with anger. "Don't insult me with vague apologies. I saw you. I followed you to the lounge, and I watched you go to a hotel with him." She froze, the color draining from her face. Her gaze flicked around, as though searching for any plausible excuse, any way to deny the truth. But there was no denial left once she saw the fury in my eyes. After a moment, her expression crumpled. She looked older, more fragile than I'd ever seen her. I don't even know what to say," she mumbled, tears sliding down her cheeks. I stared at her, my jaw clenched. So many words fought to be spoken, accusations, demands for explanations, pleas to tell me this was a misunderstanding. But I knew it wasn't. Instead, What came out was a cold, quiet question: how long? Alina swallowed hard, arms wrapping around herself protectively. A few months, she whispered. I never planned for it to happen, it just happened. I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared. You were scared? I repeated, letting out a harsh laugh. That's funny, because you sure didn't look scared when you walked into that hotel with him. She winced, pressing her lips together. Please, let me explain, she pleaded, tears glistening under the early morning light. It's not just some fling. I mean, I know how it looks, but I'm confused about everything, about us, about how I feel. I shook my head, fury and heartbreak battling inside me. Confused? You call lying to me for months confusion? No, Alina, that's not confusion, that's betrayal. That's deliberate. You had to make plans, to text him, to sneak around behind my back. She took a step forward, as if to reach out to me, but I backed away. The thought of her touch now felt like acid on my skin. Her hand dropped to her side, her eyes searching mine. I never wanted to hurt you, she managed. I was just unhappy, and I didn't know how to face it. I never meant. I don't want to hear that, I snapped, my voice cracking. You might not have set out to hurt me, but you did. And you kept doing it, over and over, each time you lied about your girl's night out. I paused, swallowing back the lump in my throat. Who is he? Do I know him? She shook her head. His name is Tristan. He's someone I met at a networking event. We started talking about work, about our passions, and it escalated. I never thought it would go this far. Silence fell between us, thick with raw pain. I found myself fixated on the small details of her appearance, the faint scent of perfume lingering on her clothes, the bags under her eyes from a sleepless night. Then I let my gaze wander over the living room, a space once full of warmth and shared memories. Now it felt like a crime scene, every piece of furniture reminding me of what we used to be. Eventually, I spoke, my voice quieter. Where does that leave us? The question hung in the air. Part of me was still hoping she'd say something, anything, to make sense of this, to fix the gaping wound she'd opened. But all she did was lower her head, tears dripping onto the floor. I don't know, she whispered. I know I messed up, I know this is unforgivable. But I can't just snap my fingers and undo my feelings for him. A fresh wave of betrayal and anger washed over me. So, that's it? You're saying you love him? I could hear the wobble in my voice, the heartbreak beneath the fury. She hesitated, fiddling with her hands like a nervous child. I'm drawn to him, she admitted. And yes, I might have feelings I can't ignore. But that doesn't mean I stopped loving you. I'm just torn, and love doesn't work that way, I cut her off, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. If you truly loved me, you would have come to me before sneaking off to bars and hotels with another man. She tried to protest, but the words wouldn't form. I could see the guilt etched into her features, the desperation, and it only made me feel more hollow. I wanted to scream at her for dismantling our marriage so carelessly, for robbing me of the security and trust one once had. The only thing I could do was stand there, letting the crushing weight of reality settle in. Finally, exhaustion took over. My mind had run out of things to say or ask, and my body was running on fumes. I told her I needed space, that I wasn't sure if we could recover from this. She asked if she should leave, perhaps stay with a friend for a while. The rational part of me wanted her gone so I could grieve without seeing her face every minute. But I also felt a twisted sense of not wanting her to run off to him. In the end, I nodded and let her pack a small bag. She left, tears silently falling, telling me she'd be at her sister's place. I didn't respond, just watched her walk out the door, the quiet echo of it closing marking the end of what we used to be. The days that followed were a blur. I told my boss I needed some personal time, and thankfully he didn't pry too deeply. I spent hours wandering the house, occasionally pausing to stare at photos of us in happier times. Our wedding picture became almost unbearable to look at, a mocking reminder of promises broken. I tried to recall every sign of her dissatisfaction, every clue that she might have been drifting away, but the puzzle pieces wouldn't form a clear picture in my head. All I knew was that something had snapped in our marriage, and I didn't see a way to mend it. Alina texted me now and then, asking how I was, offering apologies, suggesting we see a counselor. She claimed she didn't want to lose me, that she was willing to end things with Tristan if that's what it took. But the heartbreak had hardened into a shell around me, and I doubted every word she said. The trust was gone. Maybe counseling could help, or maybe it would just drag out the inevitable realization that we were past the point of no return. Still, I agreed to a meeting with a marriage counselor, if only to see if there was something worth salvaging. A small, naive hope clung to me like a last lifeline. Sitting in the counselor's office was surreal. Alina and I perched on a love seat, not touching, barely looking at each other, while a soft-spoken therapist asked us questions about our history, our communication, our desires. Alina recounted how she felt we'd grown apart, how she felt unfulfilled, neglected in some emotional sense. She claimed she never had the courage to express this to me, worried I'd dismiss her or fail to understand. And then Tristan came along, offering her excitement, validation, a spark of something new. I listened to her words, a sick feeling in my gut. The counselor turned to me, asking how I felt. At first, I couldn't form coherent sentences, just a wave of bitterness. Eventually, I managed to say that none of her reasons justified such a betrayal. The counselor nodded, acknowledging my pain. But the session ended with no clear resolution, just an arrangement to meet again next week. That night, Alina and I sat in separate chairs in our living room, the silence thick. She was temporarily back home, per the counselor's suggestion that we try to communicate in a neutral environment. At one point, she broke the quiet, whispering, "I do want to fix this." I wanted to believe her, but my heart was still raw. Part of me felt like an idiot for even entertaining the notion of patching things up with someone who could so easily lie to my face. Another part still clung to the memory of our vows, our laughter, the affection we once shared. I simply nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. She must have sensed my hesitation, because she added, "I ended it with him. I blocked his number. He knows I'm trying to save my marriage." The sincerity in her tone was palpable, but I'd seen how easily she could hide things when it suited her. Still, I forced myself to ask the question I'd been dreading, why him? She shrugged, tears pooling in her eyes. He listened in a way I hadn't experienced in a while. It felt new, exciting. I can't explain it without sounding selfish. Selfish. That word hung in the air. Yes, it was selfish, I wanted to scream, so unbelievably selfish. But the raw intensity of my anger had subsided into a resigned ache. We talked in circles, rehashing the same points, never quite reaching an understanding. We ended up in bed, on opposite sides, silent. I stayed wide awake, aware of her presence next to me, remembering the nights when I'd curl up behind her, content in the knowledge we belonged to each other. Now, the space between us felt like an uncrossable gulf. The second counseling session was more tense. The therapist pressed us on our willingness to move forward. Alina insisted she was dedicated to earning back my trust, listing changes she was making, sharing her phone passwords, inviting me to meet her coworkers, offering to be transparent about her schedule. I acknowledged these gestures, but they felt too little, too late. There was a deeper wound that her confessions couldn't easily heal. The therapist asked me if I still saw a future together. My mouth went dry. Despite my turmoil, a part of me did want to salvage something. If we can rebuild trust, I said quietly, maybe. Alina clutched my hand, tears in her eyes. It was the first time we'd touched in weeks. For a while, we tried. I made an effort to open up about my pain, to share the nights I spent awake, replaying images of her with Tristan. She explained her emotional distance, how she'd felt we'd lost our connection. Slowly, a semblance of closeness returned. She stopped going out at odd hours, she started wearing her wedding ring again, which she'd taken off during her affair. There was a tentative warmth in our interactions. But every time her phone buzzed, my chest tightened. Every time she was 5 minutes late, I wondered if she'd relapsed. She could sense the distrust and it weighed on her. One night, about 2 months into counseling, she suggested we go on a real date, to create a new memory. We chose a cozy Italian restaurant, one we'd visited years ago when we were still dating. At first, the atmosphere felt strained, but as the evening wore on, we slipped into easier conversation, jokes about the staff, reminiscing about old trips. For a moment, I almost believed we could find our way back to each other. Then, her phone buzzed from inside her purse. I watched her tense up. She glanced at the screen, then looked away quickly. My heart sank. I must have stiffened, because she immediately offered to show me. She pulled out the phone, revealing a name I didn't recognize, but assured me it was just a coworker from her marketing department. I wanted to believe her. I tried to push away the suspicion that never left my mind. Despite these efforts, the weight of what had happened loomed over us like a thundercloud. Whenever she laughed at a text, or whenever I went through her phone logs, it felt forced. The very act of double-checking her phone felt toxic to me, but I couldn't help it. One night, in a tearful argument, she said she felt suffocated, that she couldn't rebuild trust if I kept suspecting her every move. I retorted that trust doesn't regrow overnight after betrayal. It was an ugly scene, both of us crying, both of us resentful. We went to bed in stony silence, me on one edge, her on the other. The counselor tried to mediate, but ultimately told us that the decision lay in our hands. Either we found a way to truly forgive and commit to moving forward, or we ended the relationship to spare ourselves prolonged agony. After weeks of ups and downs, small victories followed by crushing setbacks, I began to realize something. I wasn't sure I could ever look at her the same way again. The memory of her slipping into that hotel with another man, after lying about a simple girl's night, was imprinted on my mind. It colored every interaction. I started feeling numb around her, even when she tried to be sweet or apologetic. She sensed it, and she too retreated, as though bracing for an inevitable end. The final tipping point came on a Saturday morning. I found a spare phone charger tucked behind the couch, a type of charger we didn't use for our phones. For a moment, I froze, my mind racing with possibilities. When I asked her about it, she stammered and said maybe it was left by someone who visited. But the fear in her eyes told a different story. All the old suspicions flared up. Had Tristan come over at some point, or was there another device I didn't know about? She insisted she hadn't invited him here. She clung to me, desperate, saying she had no idea how the charger got there. But I couldn't breathe. It felt like drowning in a tide of renewed distrust. I walked out of the house, ignoring her pleas to talk, driving around aimlessly until the sun began to set, tears blurring my vision. When I returned, she was gone. A note on the kitchen table read, "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore." I don't know if she left because she couldn't face my anger again or if she was running back to him. In that moment, strangely, I felt relief. The constant tension, the cycle of suspicion and guilt, wore me down in ways I hadn't even fully realized. It was over. Our marriage, the illusions, the attempts at reconciliation, it had all crumbled under the weight of her lies and my inability to forgive. I sat on the couch, staring at the note, a hollow ache in my chest. Even though I felt relief, I also felt a wave of sadness. The love we once shared was real, at least for a time. But it had died somewhere along this journey of deceit. The process of separation and divorce was as painful as one might expect. We communicated mainly through texts and lawyers, dividing assets, deciding who got what. She asked me once if there was any chance we could keep talking, remain friends, or at least end amicably. I was too raw to be polite. I told her I needed to move on, that I couldn't pretend everything was fine. She cried, "I'm told, but I didn't see it." I stayed at a friend's place for a few weeks, unsure how to handle the quiet emptiness of our house. Eventually, I moved back in, alone, and started clearing out her things. Each item I packed into boxes felt like I was erasing a chapter of my life, but it had to be done. Even the wedding album, I tucked it away in the attic, not ready to throw it out, but unable to have it on display. Over the next few months, I discovered the extent to which she'd been living a double life. A mutual acquaintance admitted they'd seen her with Tristan before, and that it clearly wasn't innocent. Photos surfaced on social media, none with them posing together, but I could see them in the background of group shots, standing close, looking like a couple. All while she told me she was out with her girlfriends. I tried not to dwell on it, reminding myself that the relationship was already over, that I had to focus on rebuilding my life. But the betrayal stung fresh every time I stumbled upon another reminder. At first, I grappled with sleepless nights, replaying every argument, every moment of confusion. I kept asking myself why I didn't confront her sooner, why I didn't demand honesty when I first suspected something was off. But guilt is a tricky thing. It didn't matter how or when I discovered her deceit, the result would have been the same. Eventually, I realized the pointlessness of self-blame. I couldn't control her actions, only my own response. The simplest way forward was to accept that some questions might never have answers. Was she truly in love with Tristan, or just enthralled by novelty? Did she ever really love me in the way I thought she did? Those unknowns would only torment me if I let them. So, I chose to let the questions remain unanswered. I poured my energy into my job, taking on new projects that forced me to focus. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected in the turmoil of my failing marriage. A few months down the line, I moved to a smaller apartment, wanting a fresh start away from the memories etched into every room of our old home. Alina and I maintained minimal contact to finalize the divorce proceedings. The only time we saw each other was in the lawyer's office, sitting in stiff silence, exchanging pained glances that spoke of regrets and unspoken words. The day the divorce was finalized, she texted me a simple, "I'm sorry for everything," and I responded with, "Take care." That was the last real conversation we had. Over a year later, the wounds still haven't fully healed. Sometimes I wake up from a dream of our early days, the laughter, the excitement of newlyweds exploring life together, and it takes me a moment to remember we aren't together anymore. There are days the grief hits me unexpectedly, like when I see a restaurant we loved or hear a song she used to play while cooking dinner. But I'm learning to embrace my independence, to find solace in the fact that I didn't compromise my dignity by living a lie. I discovered her betrayal, and even though it broke me, it also freed me from continuing a marriage built on deception. From time to time, mutual acquaintances update me about Alina, how she's doing. Some say she's with Tristan, others say they broke up. Honestly, I don't have the emotional bandwidth to care. Let her live her life. I'm trying to live mine. There's no satisfaction in seeing her in pain, if she indeed regrets her choices. The best closure I can hope for is forging a new path, rediscovering who I am outside the identity of a husband. I still think about the night I followed her, how my decision to put aside my guilt about spying led me to the truth I needed to confront. Would it have been better not to know? No. Living in ignorance would have rotted me from the inside. Finding out was catastrophic, but it allowed me to rebuild. It forced me to face reality, to salvage what self-respect I could. Trust is a fragile thing, and once shattered, it can rarely be pieced together without cracks. I have scars now, emotional ones, but scars can remind us that we survived something that threatened to destroy us. If someone were to ask me what I learned from this ordeal, I'd say it taught me the importance of honest communication. If Alina had come to me when she felt the first pang of dissatisfaction, maybe we could have tackled it together. Or maybe we still would have ended, but with less collateral damage. Deceit benefits no one in the long run. I also learned the depth of my own resilience. I endured heartbreak I never imagined I could handle, and I'm still standing. I might have trust issues going forward, but I also know that I won't ignore red flags just to keep a false peace. Life goes on in its unrelenting way. New friendships form, old ones fade, and time marches on whether we're ready or not. In the quiet moments, I sometimes miss the innocence I had before that night. I miss believing wholeheartedly that my wife would never lie, that a simple mention of a girl's night out was exactly what it seemed. But maybe innocence is overrated. Experience, as brutal as it can be, shapes us in ways that help us grow. I can't change what happened. I can only decide how I move forward. I've started dating again, cautiously. Early on, I feel compelled to explain my history of betrayal, half expecting the new person to recoil, as if heartbreak were contagious. But some understand, some have faced their own nightmares. We connect over scars, forming a fragile bond of empathy. It's never easy to trust again, but each day I build a little more confidence, reminding myself that not everyone is Alina, and not every relationship is doomed to end in heartbreak. Occasionally, I look back on the moment I confronted her about the lounge and the hotel, and I question whether I handled it all correctly. Could I have been more compassionate, more controlled? Perhaps. Yet, the outcome probably would have been the same. Infidelity rarely has neat, amicable endings. Emotions run high, logic takes a back seat, and the sense of betrayal clouds everything. I try not to fault myself too harshly. In an impossible situation, any reaction is both right and wrong in its own way. I hope that wherever Alina ends up in life, she finds clarity and honesty. I hope she doesn't repeat the cycle of half-truths and hidden rendezvous. But that's not my journey anymore. My concern is living with integrity, learning from the mistakes that happened on both sides. I'm sure I contributed to the breakdown of our marriage in ways I didn't fully see. That's my lesson, to communicate better, to pay attention to my partner's feelings, and to never let complacency blind me to problems that need addressing. Looking back at the night I followed her, I realize it was the defining moment that set me on this path. I dreaded playing detective, dreaded what I might discover, but not knowing would have been worse. Each step I took that night, creeping around the lounge windows, watching her talk intimately with another man, following them to the boutique hotel, each step shattered the illusions I clung to. Illusions that maybe we were okay, that maybe I was just being paranoid. Confronting the truth head-on was devastating but ultimately necessary. That night, my world collapsed. But in the rubble, I found an unexpected strength to rebuild something new, something that, with time, might become more authentic than what I had before. Now, standing in my own apartment, watching the city lights twinkle through the windows, I often reflect on how life can change so drastically with a single choice. One moment, you're confident in your life's direction, the next, everything is in freefall. I've come to accept that heartbreak is part of the human condition. We can't guard against it entirely if we're genuinely open to love. Perhaps that's the cost of connection. Yet, as painful as it was, I wouldn't trade my ability to love wholeheartedly just to avoid the risk of betrayal. It's better to have given all of myself in a relationship, even if it ended in heartbreak, than to have never loved deeply at all. And so I move forward, day by day, carrying the lessons and the scars, trying to be more aware of my needs and the needs of anyone I might love in the future. I'm not the same person I was before Alina's affair. Part of me mourns the wide-eyed optimism I used to have. But I also feel a new sense of self-awareness, a maturity that comes only from weathering storms. It's a slow, uneven process. Sometimes I stumble, sometimes I fall back into anger or regret. But slowly, I'm healing. Slowly, I'm learning to trust my own judgment again. And one day, maybe I'll trust someone else enough to share my life with them. If that happens, I'll enter it with caution, yes, but also with hope. Because despite everything, I still believe in love, just a more honest version of it. In the end, I don't regret following Alina that night. It was a painful path but a necessary one. I discovered a truth I needed to face, and although it led to the end of our marriage, it also led to a deeper understanding of myself. Life doesn't always turn out the way we plan, and sometimes the illusions we cherish must be broken so we can see reality clearly. I may never fully comprehend how she could lie so easily about a simple girl's night out, but I've accepted that I don't need all the answers to move on. The important thing is that I survived it, and I'm still here, ready to find a better tomorrow for myself.